remain very valid. And a lot of things that we are discussing and diving into will have some natural transitions. So just checking once again that we have Dr. Raj with us. Can we just check? Dr. Raj, are you here with us? And is
yes,
your
yes,
mic on?
I'm here. I'm here. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, my apologies. I was using the old link and just check the new one, updated link.
That is all right. That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I was just starting with the intro. So, welcoming everyone again.
I'll unmute, okay?
Okay, no problem. So welcome again, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for joining us again. And today we are going to dive into Global Compact for Migration Objective number 21, which calls upon states to cooperate in facilitating dignified, sustainable return, readmission, and reintegration. And before we get into this, just thanking all the different organizations that are behind this webinar. That's the Migrant Forum in Asia, the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, and the Civil Society Action Committee. And I will be your moderator for this afternoon session, and my name is Paddy Sianga Knudsen, and I am with the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism. So, as I was saying before, we have really come very far along our objectives, the GCM Objective Series, review series, where we've touched on many aspects of the migration journey and also looking at different aspects around the migration space as well. And we have concurrently been running special lectures alongside this for our students who join us in the rooms every Tuesday. Without much further ado, thinking about objective, what really brings us here. I think this is one of those objectives, like some of the others and most of the others, that is really intertwined with other aspects and that look very closely to what the spectrum of a migrant's journey is like. And today we're talking about return. And now we know that return cannot be looked in isolation from a migrant's journey. It's really a part of the journey, and in some cases can be a re-return. We want to, with the panelists that we have with us, who I will introduce in a moment, we want to understand what provisions are around this objective, and what are states and actors as a whole of society encouraged to do. We know that the objective calls and encourages voluntary returns and discourages forced returns, but we still know that there are questions around what is voluntary. How does assisted migration look like, and what happens in the case when there is not assisted returns? How do we ensure safe and dignified experiences all through the journey? So from the return until the reintegration. What role do various agencies have to play in the countries that are sending back the migrants? And how are migrants moving from the title of being a migrant to becoming a returnee? What does that really look like in ensuring also that they have the necessary support, logistical and documentational support for their safe and dignified return? We want to talk a little bit also about other factors. How can this have a much more gender responsive approach? How can we look at special provisions? For instance, when we think about children, unaccompanied minors and separated children that are involved, that are being returned to their countries of origin, or to countries where there's a particular agreement. How does that really work? We're talking about, how do we, in rebuilding these migrants once they have been returned to their countries of origin, what kind of support is there to make sure that they are able to handle the different pressing needs that they may have? We do know that there are needs that are related to medical treatment, to housing, to education, for instance, for school-age children. How are they reintegrated back into these systems? And how can returns and reintegration programs therefore be also tailor-made so that they can take care of some of the vulnerabilities that are arising from this? I think this objective also very much, is linked around the role of different actors, so we talked about the role of the host country, for instance, but in the host country, we're also looking at consular support from the country of origin of these migrants. And we're also looking at the support that they receive in terms of being received back through the administrative procedures of their home countries. We're looking at the role of donors who are taking much a higher role in terms of financing return programs and trying to encourage safe and dignified returns and voluntary returns. We're looking at organizations themselves that are involved in preparing migrants, supporting migrants as they make their journeys back home. We're looking at the countries of origin and the kind of, so it's really a whole of society and a whole of a government approach, and on both ends. We are also thinking about data. You know, what does that mean in terms of sustained reintegration? When we talk about, and here we're talking about qualitative data, what do we know about these populations of people returning? And once we know what we know, what measures are we putting in place so we can, you know, allow for vibrant migrants to be provided with these needs, whether we're talking about unaccompanied migrant children, pregnant women, the elderly, victims of trafficking, victims of torture, single parents, for instance, and just, you know, understanding the vulnerabilities that migrants may have as part of that they have experienced as part of this journey. I also think that, you know, it would be very important for us, and we cannot leave this discussion, to talk about these communities, you know, that migrants are coming back to. How are we sensitizing communities to make them aware that their own citizens, their brothers, their sisters, their neighbors are coming back? And how do we reduce the shame that is sometimes attached to people returning home, for they are seen as a failure. They are seen to have made failed journeys or failed attempts at improving not just their own personal livelihoods, but supporting these families. How is that looked at in that approach? We cannot leave the conversation without COVID, so I'm hoping we can, you know, we have this panel here that can also take us through what has been happening during COVID, what has COVID brought out in terms of our practices, what is COVID shaking us to do and reminding us and prompting us to do, whether we're looking at migration coming from the Gulf to the Gulf countries going to Southeast Asia, to Africa, whether we're looking at returns from Libya, Niger, South Africa, for instance, to different parts of the world, from Europe to South America, and so on and so forth. What, you know, what is happening to migrants that have been stranded in these cases? So much to touch on, and I think many linkages, but that is why we have a panel and not me to speak with you. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce our panel. We will start off with Dr. Raj Bardoi, who is a former senior economic affairs officer with the United Nations, and she's from the Commonwealth of Dominica. We have Mr. Luis Carrasquino, who is the project coordinator for the Assisted Voluntary Returns and Reintegration Program, and he's coming from the International Organization for Migration in Portugal. We have Mr. Anisur Rahman Khan, who is the director of the migration of Awaj Foundation, and also the co-founder of the Welfare Association of Repatriated Bangladeshi Employees. Ms. Mercedes Perez, who is the manager for a support program for returned migrants in an organization known as the Mennonite Social Action Commission, and she's joining us from Honduras, so it's very early in the morning. Mr. Jeremiah Opiniano, who is the assistant professor in journalism at the University of Santo Tomas. We will start off and go directly to Dr. Raj because we would like to catch up on time. We have 5 panelists, and it's we're really looking forward to diving into the issues. Let me just introduce to you Dr. Raj. Dr. Raj holds a PhD degree in economics, and after teaching for several years in universities in the Caribbean and in African countries, she has worked as a senior economist for international organizations, including the United Nations Development Program and other UN agencies. And particularly her work has focused on Caribbean and African development issues and challenges that have also included migration and development. Currently, she's an independent international development consultant based in Dominica, and she focuses on international migration issues in small island states in the Caribbean and looks at also cross-border trade. Dr. Raj, I am a big fan of you, and I think that this question really fits, the question that we have for you really fits your profile, but also your wide experience. So could you just share with us sort of your reflections of what you look at in terms of, you know, the set of actions, your analysis, and what your reflections would be in terms of the various stakeholders, you know, from the state side and the non-state side in origin countries that can be engaged in, you know, sustainably reintegrating returned migrants, and also touching for us on the challenges. Over to you, Dr. Raj.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paddy, and thank you, organizers, for inviting me. I think Paddy has already sketched what I was trying to say. What we are talking about in Objective 1 is basically safe return and reintegration, return, acceptance, and reintegration of returned migrants. So there are the three aspects in 21, Objective 21, and a set of actions. There are a set of 9 actions. And Paddy has alluded to some, and I think for those of you who may not have consulted Objective 21, let me just quickly go over that the final draft of this compact addresses the processes of expulsion, which include return, safe return, and then reacceptance by origin countries and sustainable reintegration of return migrants. And a set of 10 objectives is a set of 10 actions is very quickly, I will develop and implement bilateral, regional, and multilateral cooperation framework and agreements, including readmission agreements, promote gender-responsive and child-sensitive return and reintegration programs that Paddy already mentioned, cooperate in identification of nationals and issuing of travel documents by consular services, foster institutional contacts between consular authorities and relevant officials from home countries of origin, ensure that the return of migrants who don't have legal right to stay in another state are safely returned. The reason I want to read is so that I can reflect on these and focus how, what that means and how keen the host countries are to have these migrants on their shores. Establish and strengthen national monitoring mechanisms on return in partnership with relevant stakeholders that provide independent recommendation on ways and means to strengthen accountability. And the next one is ensure and return readmission processes involving children are carried out only after determining of best interests for these kids, and then facilitate the sustainable integration of returning migrants. And lastly, identifying and addressing the needs of communities to which these migrants are going to be returned to. Okay, so what I want to focus on are a couple of things. Firstly, I think this Objective 1 should be read very carefully, and it clearly expresses the intent to return the migrants who are not needed as soon or as fast as is possible. So when it comes to sending them safely and humanely, I think there's a lot to be desired. The whole idea is that they want to process them quickly. So in order to process them, these migrants have to be identified by the national authorities, such as the consulars, authorities which are in that country, as well as sometimes authorities from the home country. Often, when the negotiation, when the process is discussed, these authorities are brought along with the host country immigration authorities and the migrants. They're sitting together discussing where they're coming from, to identify them, where they're coming from, which country they're coming from, what language they speak, which group they belong to. So this is discussed before ascertaining whether they are deportable. You see what I mean? In other words, this has to be checked before you bring in the home country authorities to expose these people, because then they can be tortured if they are deported or sent back. Now they are subject to be, and their rights are going to be violated, and there are often violations. And the case in point, I think Amnesty International had done a study of 90 or 100 Sudanese who had gone to the EU a couple of years ago, 2017, and they did this study. And then around 2018, they were trying to deport about 60. And in that process, they brought in the consular authorities, Sudanese, who were based in Brussels. And they also brought in people from Khartoum. And as a result, while they're discussing who they are, where they're coming from, what their tribe is, why they are here, they had exposed these would-be deportees to the national authorities of the home countries. So 10 of them were deported, not all. 60 are still, the cases are pending. Now, these 10 were tortured in Khartoum when they arrived, and the news got back to Brussels. So they held back the other 60 whose cases are still being processed. So the point I'm making here is that while we can put these commitments on paper, what happens on the ground is another story. And therefore, I think civil society organizations, faith-based organizations, other NGOs and state actors have to be more vigilant in seeing that the rights of their citizens are protected, not only in their own home countries, but also in the host countries, to see how they follow these procedures as to not jeopardize or expose these people. Okay, the second one I want to refer to is that while there is mention of sending people, returning people, and home countries or the origin countries, accepting them and reintegrating them, it seems the onus or the responsibilities rest squarely on the shoulders of the home countries or the countries of origin. In other words, there's more responsibility on the home countries or the countries that are origin countries than so much on the host countries. The host countries may facilitate by providing some financial resources or in-kind assistance in the process of return, which they do because it's in their interest. So these people are not languishing around on their territory, because once they are on their territory, they are obligated by international law to provide them the sustenance, whether it's shelter, food, health, legal aid, and so on, which means, and they're still there without any legal status, and they are in a limbo. So there is no provision or reference in Objective 21 to Objective 5, which talks about legalization, following legal pathways to regularize migration. Okay, so there's no reference, even though Objective 5 has to look for legal pathways as to how to regularize people who can stay. But there's no mention in Objective 21 to Objective 5. So in some cases, there are ways to provide legal safe ways or pathways to regularize the migration of some of these people who cannot be deported. There are some who cannot be deported, who cannot be sent back because of either their political involvement or whatever. So these people, there have to be ways, whether on compassionate grounds or whether on humanitarian grounds, there have to be some pathways to regularize their stay. At this point, I think I want to mention what recently happened in Colombia. As you know, the crisis in Venezuela, people are running here, there, and there, they're all over trying to flee the country. It's a crisis situation. So about 1.6 million or 1.7 million Venezuelans had crossed over to Colombia. Now, the Colombian government has taken a very bold and a very interesting step to offer them regularization. So it's okay, fine. You have the choice to be regularized and stay here as regular for 10 years. And after that time, you can decide if you want to stay or you go back. And that gives enough time, hopefully, for the country to stabilize. Now, this is a very bold and a recent step. How far they've gone, I don't know. I only got the news, I think, a few days ago, that this is the step they have taken. Other countries are taking them, but they have not talked about regularizing. They are just sheltering them until their cases are processed. So this is very disappointing that Objective 21 made no mention or even reference to Objective 5. So this suggests clearly that what they're really after, all these things talks, is to make sure you get rid of them as fast as you can. Now, what you do with them is your issue. How you and mark the word sustainable reintegration, meaning you put them sustainably so they don't come back to us again. See, this is very interesting. Sustainable reintegration, not just reintegration, but sustainable. so they don't turn around and start coming back to those shores. You see, this is really, it's good in a way that they have put in certain commitments for gender sensitivity and children's rights and so on. But these are already, there are covenants on children's rights and so on, and to which member states are signatories. So there's nothing new in that. So they have, by international law, to follow that. So in conclusion, what I'm trying to say is that it's like, we don't want you to go back, and your countries have to accept you because you are their nationals. So to say that they must readmit, obviously they have to readmit you because you belong to that country. So this commitment that, you know, they must readmit, I thought it was a bit superfluous because it's taken for granted. You're a national of country X and you go to country X and they have to take you. Because if you're going there, that means you are admissible. The reason you're not going there is because that's the reason you left the country, because you could not stay there. So it's not that they are going to turn around to send you back. So this for me was a bit superfluous to say readmitting your own national. It is taken for granted, right? So the ones who will come back are admissible. So readmission, but reintegration this is where there has to be a framework. How these people are going to be reintegrated. The case in point, for example, as farm workers. Even from the Caribbean, we sent quite a few people to Canada, to America for 2 months, 3 months. They come back in large numbers. What do? There is no reintegration plan for them. They wait for the next season to go again or go somewhere else. So home countries or the countries of origin perhaps need to prepare some kind of framework to integrate them socially, economically, and as Paddy mentioned, to come back as a deportee or returnee without assets, while you have spent a lot of money going there, is emotionally as well as socially very, very taxing. How do you show your face to your families that you plundered their limited resources and then you come back empty-handed to be, again, a burden on them? How do you get accepted? So there's a lot of this psychosocial work that needs to be done on these people. I mean, although there's a little mention in the action, but to what extent home countries are prepared for those services, and to what extent those services already exist or don't exist, and whether they will reach them, and how the families will have to be also given emotional support because they go back to them, society. So there's a lot of pressure. So before such steps are taken, I think a lot of thinking has to go into this, both in terms of sending countries as well as host countries. So in the end, how do they get integrated? See, and they are saying in the action that in their social, in their economic, national plans as well as local plans, they must have a framework whereby there are integration policies. Now, this is a big talk. I mean, we all know from developing countries that, you know, there are no policies. You're just left to your devices. In the case of the Philippines, they do prepare people to go abroad, right? And they are done meticulously. I don't know if there's any provision when they come back to put them back, unless people fend for themselves. So I think it will be nice to hear from those who are on the ground and who have done some work as to what are the good examples that we can learn from in terms of reintegration and how successful they have been in not only retaining these people, but how successful they have been in terms of motivating these people and, in fact, encouraging them to contribute to the development of their own countries. So eventually there is no need to look outward as a necessity rather than looking outward as an opportunity to broaden yourself. I think I'll stop here and
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Raj. Thank you, Dr. Raj, for that. I feel like, you know, you've given us a very good footing in terms of how we should look at sustainable reintegration. And I think, you know, putting it in a very interesting way that sustainable reintegration should really be the type that doesn't encourage particularly new, unsafe migrations, because as one of the criticisms I think that has come around reintegration programs that have been there, and we'll hear a bit from IOM, who will be the next speaker in a bit, is to understand what is happening around the space of reintegration. Are we just equipping returnees with skills that allow them to make new journeys which are unsafe? Because I think there is something about new journeys that are safe, but it's important to coin that a lot of the new journeys are unsafe because migrants have returned, and when their communities look at them, they are looking at them as a disrupted journey. So it's not the end. You went, you tried, you've been brought back by IOM, you can try again. So you are sort of just always in this transition. And I think it's very important linkage you've made to development in the particular country, to understand what development is like in the particular country as a push factor for new migration journeys, or for continued migration journeys for those migrants who have been returned. I would just come back to you a little bit later, and maybe you can have a think about, you talked about the role of the civil society in terms of this reintegration. And here particularly, I wanted to ask if you look at returnees themselves as messengers, can we, how do you see the role of migrant groups? And as migrant groups, I'm talking about, prospective migrant groups, but also returnees, people who have returned home, as being the messengers for discouraging unsafe migration and in the prospect of saving lives. I like the linkage that you made to legal pathways, which I think in a lot of forums is called the cornerstone, because it is the starting point. I would not make an unsafe migration choice if I knew there was a legal one. And I think maybe if you could also talk to us a little bit when we come back about the concept of circular migration. So, while we understand what legal pathways would be like, and they always sound like, governments and have to open up their borders as it is. But, is there something, you could talk to us in the mobility aspect that looks at circular migration and how that could be an interesting catch into understanding, connecting us back into this objective. I would just ask to pass on then to the next speaker, that is Luis Carrasquinho, who is from the International Organization for Migration and he's based in the IOM office there in Portugal. Just checking that your video is coming on, Luis. And Luis has worked for the IOM in Portugal since 2007, where he is the focal point for the Assistant Voluntary Return and Reintegration and project there. And there's a particular project there that looks at AVRR, predominantly looking at returns to Brazil. So it would be very interesting to also hear from that perspective. He's the focal point for assistance for vulnerable migrants, and he's also covering trafficking in human beings. He has experience in operations as well as a counselor for migrants. And Luis, as you turn on your camera there, just to check, could you just talk to us a bit about how you sort of see partnerships and cooperation being essential in assistance, voluntary returns and reintegration programs, and how do you think really they contribute to the facilitation of safe and dignified returns, as well as looking at the sustainable integration side, as Dr. Raj had put. And we know that you'll be speaking to us from a Portuguese perspective. And in there, I would just add that, if you could really also voice in the migrant, we would like to see the migrant more visibly, because we do know that IOM has these global frameworks and principles, but how do we see the visible voice of the migrant? And here I challenge you to talk a little bit about this voluntary return. How voluntary is it? Because we've heard in some cases, it's like, how can you say something is voluntary if it's my only option? So maybe you can talk to us about, the principles that are around and how voluntarism sort of fits within the framework of the return. Over to you, Luis.
Okay, good afternoon and good morning, good evening. I don't know if someone is, I see that we have a lot of people around the world today. So first of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this initiative. It is really a pleasure to be here and to be able to discuss these issues and these topics with you, and also to greet the other speakers and everyone assisting this discussion. and congratulate the organization for bringing this timely event and topic for discussion. I think it is really important to discuss the Global Pact for Migration. And this is something that we are also doing here in Portugal with the implementation program. And it is very important to bring civil society, academia, and all other actors to come together and discuss and promote this discussion over the objectives of the Global Compact for Migration. So, as you rightly pointed out, I have some extensive experience working with AVRR, working on the field and working directly with communities. The program in Portugal is quite I wouldn't say quite different, but that has some particularities when we talk about voluntary return and reintegration in the context of the European Union. Because the majority of these migrants coming to IOM and asking for our assistance are Brazilian nationals. In fact, it's more than 90% of our caseload. And if we expand a little bit to Portuguese-speaking countries, we are talking about 95 to 97% of our caseload. So there's a trend here that is important and that influences the intervention. So about partnerships and about cooperation. Well, I think we all agree that to implement successfully AVRR programs, this requires a lot of cooperation and a lot of participation from a broad range of actors. This includes civil society, state and non-state actors, governments, both in host, transit, and countries of origin. So the partnerships should be diversified and should involve a range of national and international stakeholders. So I believe that we all agree with this, that in the field of migration, no one alone can work. It is not possible. The strength of the intervention is related to the partnerships that we can create, and as more diversified as we partner, the more complete and will be our intervention. I think that this is important. So in the field of reintegration and in what is related to IOM intervention, and specifically in the context we operate here in Portugal, how do we see partnership and how do we see this cooperation? So we see this cooperation at two levels, because we are talking about host country, Portugal, and we are talking about country of origin, Brazil. So this is the example that I can provide to you. And we are promoting this partnership and this cooperation at these two levels. In Portugal, for the information and counseling, because this is the cornerstone. This is very important when we are talking about a migrant that is willing to return to his or her own country of origin, regardless what is the reason behind that willing to return. It is important to have information, and this information will shape the decision of return. As we see it here, and as we promote it, it is indeed something that it comes from the will of the person to return. So if the person doesn't want to do so, and at a later stage decides, no, I gave it a second thought and I don't want to go don't want to return to the country of origin, so this process is cancelled, and we don't push for the person to return. So this network of partners that we have here, they are coming from the civil society, they are coming from the network of local and national support centers, and they are providing this information on the first line, information that is crucial for the decision process. On the other hand, on the country of origin side, and on the reintegration specific implementation, we also have a network for reintegration. This network is composed not only by IOM missions they are participating in the provision and in the monitoring of the reintegration assistance, but also civil society partners. And we are talking here about Brazil, which is a very complex reality. So all of the focal points that are monitoring and that are assisting migrants in the implementation of their integration plans are coming from the civil society. And they provide not only this assistance and this monitoring, but also referring migrants to additional support when there is a need for that. But this is only part of the solution. So in our opinion and based on what is our intervention, the IOM promoted solutions are only part of that solution. It is important, as Dr. Raj pointed out, to involve other organizations. IOM-based programs or AVRR IOM-based programs can only go until a certain extent. For this intervention to be as more complete as possible, it is important to involve other actors, to involve other partners. For example, when we talk about reintegration, we talk about in-kind or in-cash assistance. It depends on the context, right? But this is limited. When we talk about in-kind or in-cash assistance, this is not an inflow that lasts forever. It has a ceiling, you know. So if it has a ceiling, it will come to a time that this will end, or it has been fully used, or somehow. So that's the reason I said that this is part of the solution, because we need to go beyond that mentality of in-kind or in-cash assistance. It is important to involve the reintegration dynamic in local development initiatives, for instance, and to bring it all along, to have some complementarity. And this is where it's difficult to intervene, because in some realities, AVRR is not on a political agenda. So governments, it's not that they consider good or bad. They don't consider it at all. When we talk about Brazil, for example, the inclusion of assisted voluntary return and reintegration in their agenda is something that it's not, I don't say it's not important. It's been growing, but they have other situations and other issues that are more important, and they need to consider. So if we do if we think about it, it's something that needs to be, we need to push forward to bring this along and to include this in political agendas. As for voluntariness, and just to briefly mention the topic, I know that this is a very sensitive topic, and the point here is that we need to consider voluntariness within a framework, and this framework don't consider only one principle. It considers 7 principles. Voluntariness is one of them. One can argue if it's really voluntary, or if it's not voluntary, or at what extent it is the program is or is not voluntary. But I rather prefer to focus this on safety and on dignified return, that promotes and upholds human rights. I know that this can create quite some controversial, depending on where we stand and what we are discussing. But as I was saying, when we talk about voluntariness, we need also to talk about migrant-centered response. Put the migrant in the center, and the safety, in the concept of confidentiality, of evidence-based. It is not easy there will always be criticize along voluntary return. And just to finish, I think it is really important to put migrants on the center. And most of the times, global documents don't do that. They are umbrella, and they provide the umbrella definitions and the umbrella objectives to do so. But it's up to us when we promote our programs, when we promote our initiatives, whether if it's voluntary return or if it's integration or if it's related to diaspora or whatever, to promote initiatives in the field that can put the migrant in the center, that can hear the migrant, and that can promote these measures. And over for now.
Luis, thank you. I think you've ended out on the note that we were hoping you would end out, which is, you know, looking at the migrants focused approaches and not sort of from a border security or immigration, keep people out, build wars, whether they are physical wars or on paper. And I think that goes also for what Dr. Raj had mentioned in terms of the concept of readmission. We would have expected that this is something that's natural. I think I do understand, for instance, in the concept where you have, you know, readmission that's related to, you know, for instance, in the context of the European Union, they have sort of this readmission on the basis of third country nationals. So, you know, that the third country national that may not be returned back to where they're coming from. But when we're talking about readmission of, let's say, stateless people, or we're talking about readmission of nationals, the re-entry support, it can be, it's quite puzzling, but also mind-boggling, if I would say, that it still remains a sticky issue. And there, you know, we would see issues of not really being, you know, we're not really focusing on the migrant, we're focusing on other issues and immigration policies that are not probably informed by having a more migrants rights approach. So thank you very much for bringing that in, and also just linking us back to how reintegration is really then a priority for the country itself. So I'm hoping that maybe when you come back in as a follow-up question, you know, you've mentioned that you have 95% of your returns are to Portuguese-speaking countries. So I can imagine that, you know, reintegrating back, for instance, for children who have been schooled in Portugal and are going back to Brazil, maybe not so difficult because they have that language, and maybe also for migrants going back into the workspace, you know, and also for social engagement as well, that they speak the language. But I'm just trying to think if you could walk us through a little bit when we come back. Could you talk to us about COVID, you know, and maybe using COVID as a good a setting for returns? You know, how did you use, for instance, you know, the use of technology, for instance, in reaching migrants that were stranded? How did returns happen during COVID? Maybe just as a basic question, how did you manage this? Were people stranded? Because we do know that, you know, borders were closed. We do know that maybe airlines were not flying, but what was happening in terms of mitigating and providing support for migrants who were stranded in this point, in talking about that return aspect? And how are you working with other actors on the Brazilian side? So maybe I'm asking you, for instance, for Brazil or other actors who you would say in this particular country, this is an initiative that has worked around reintegration itself. So maybe you could come in later, Luis, and share with us. And I think I will now bring in our next speaker, who's Mr. Anisu Rahman Khan. And I think he speaks to us from a very personal angle, because he himself, he's a Bangladeshi returnee migrant, and he had worked for the Rights of Migrants community as the director of the foundation, Migration of Awaj Foundation, which is a workers' rights association based in Bangladesh. So he really does understand what the plight is, and also engaging with migrants who are returned on a daily basis. His organization has a research foundation, and he's also a member of the International Migrant Alliance, which is a global network that looks at migration issues around returnees. And there's a national chapter in Bangladesh as well. Mr. Anisu is like I mentioned, he founded the Welfare Association of Repatriated Bangladeshi Employees, which was the first workers' association formed in Bangladesh. And he has gone, he has experienced this being cheated by a recruitment process, inspiring him to travel out of his country. And that led him to today who he is, he really is a migrants' rights activist in his home country, but also when he was abroad. So we would like to hear, I think, from his perspective, and he's been, well covered, and and a lot of information has gone up about him and the kind of initiatives that he has run. We would like to hear from you, Anisu, as you are unmuting your mic and as you are opening your video. Just, if you could share your a presentation with us from your own perspective as a returnee migrant and an activist. And here we want to sort of understand, what are the migrants being disgraced? What are the deprivations that they have in terms of their rights and their dignities? What was really happening around that space? And also understanding, some of the problems that are related to not having access to a safe and dignified return process, and for that matter, nothing close to what a sustainable reintegration should look like. And then, we can take on some other questions. Anisur, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Paddy. Do you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Paddy. Thank you, Dr. Raz, Louis. You have already covered my aspect. In fact, most of things Paddy already described. My name is Anisur Rahman Khan. I am a returning migrant. I am working for the migrant community, and my organization, Awaaz Foundation, it has formed in 2003. It's a worker rights-based organization. We provide the support to the female and male migrants to home and abroad, and whole cycle of the migrants. In fact, I'm not a researcher nor a academician. As a migrant and migrant rights activist, just I will share few points with you. In fact, we migrants are emotional, but our expectations are not so high. We have the commitment to our family and our country as well. I had the opportunity to be a part of the historic stock-taking consultation on GCM in December 2017 in Mexico. I was really excited by the outcome of those recommendations. The 23 objectives of GCM are really, we feel, blessing for migrant workers. The migrant workers' expectation is that the GCM will be properly implemented. There are 9 activities against the GCM Objective 21, which our experienced and learned discussion will be discussed there. I will just share my some local experience, and being a service provider, I will share my experience at home and abroad. Safe migration, repatriation, remigration, and sustainable reintegration are inseparable with dignity. I will try to see what is the attitude towards migrant workers in the whole migration process. In general, the peoples think those who don't have the ability or quality to get a job in country, only they go abroad. The devaluation of migrants started from here. When the prospective migrants go to the recruitment office, recruiters evaluate them as a product, not a human being, calling them as Adams. They are then discriminated against at every stage of their migration cycle. When especially the airport, they are victim of contempt. When this is my own experience, when I was told in the name of briefing, you are brought from them, then I will no longer be the human being. I will become a modern slave. Our embassy is a piece of our country abroad. Even I do not get the proper respect there. Why would the employer respect me? For the purpose of this webinar presentation, I talked to some Bangladeshi workers in Middle East. I asked, what would enhance your dignity? They said, to reduce the cost of migration. Our dignity will increase automatically. For an example, once their supervisor treated them badly, some of his colleagues from a neighbor countries protest and threatened to resign if they did not get the justice. But he could not because of higher migration cost, which is 10 times higher than his colleagues. High migration cost broken their backbone, that is lost their dignity. In Jordan, a Bangladeshi female migrant worker blocked her passport and sent her back to the country after the protest against her misconduct. Migrant workers in Libya have not been paid for a year. Workers were complaining to their respective embassies. One embassy's answer was like that, just to leave that place. Instead, another embassy asked the company directly to settle all the debts right now. Otherwise, they will go to the hard line against the company. That's why I proposed at the escape meeting to have a platform for labor attaché in host country where good practices will be shared. Visa status should not be a prerequisite for safe and dignified return. The undocumented situation has created by some unscrupulous employer, recruitment agencies, and brokers. Few dishonest employers and recruiters doing visa business in the name of employment. We have experienced various general amnesty in different countries. We have seen a class of brokers and employers cheated those innocent workers in the name of legalization. Last webinar meeting, Professor Dr. Tasnim Siddiqui has nicely explained those reasons why remittance have increased despite this disaster of COVID-19 in Bangladesh. But what she did not mention is that of ultimate sacrifice of migrants to send the highest remittances for their family and country in any crisis period. Example is that during the global economic crisis in 2007, at that time there was visa trading, there was also over and under invoicing on import and export business. Overall, that time economy of Bangladesh stood on remittance sending by migrants. I appreciate the governments and international agencies have done a lot for development and welfare program for migrants, but there is still a long way to go. I have some little observation about the said topics on GCM Objective 21. To cooperate and facilitate safe return and reintegration, there should be effective pre-decision and pre-departure orientation must through information dissemination and awareness development. I think need to be a strong monitoring teams of government and civil society, migrant community, and private sectors. Ensure migrants and migrants community involvement in all stages of their development. Responsible and good governance. This is very important for sustainable development, and social safety net for migrants and their family is important. Opportunity-based entrepreneurship development. Now I will stop here. If any question raised or asked, I will try to share. Thank you.
Mr. Anisu, thank you very much for sharing not just your reflections, but also having gone back to other migrants to bring what you have shared with us here today. I think it's been extremely useful for us to listen and to hear in, particularly appreciating how you share, looking at the journey of these, the journeys that migrants make. And I was just thinking about how your name changes as you move along. I mean, starting off the journey from home, you are sort of have been invisible, I guess, and difficulty for a lot of migrants, a lot of difficulty to try and make ends meet, and pushed by family pressures or pushed by individual pressures, also even pushed by conflict. They make these journeys, then they adopt a name: migrant, undocumented, illegal, foreign, and then when they have to return home, whether it's voluntary or it's something that is forced, they adopt this new name, returnee. And at the same time, you remain a human. All through this, you are the same person. And I think it just highlights what, how we really have to bring back humanity, and thinking about, these migrants whom at the same time we're expecting them to save us from economic collapse back in our home countries, to save and provide for families in terms of the social needs that are there, taking care of families, taking care of children's education, relatives, supporting communities back home. But then when it's time for a return, like you have explained, it seems we are not able as home societies to also reflect back the benefits we have been receiving. So I think when we come back, if you could talk to us a little bit about that, what you have seen from your organization as the role that, because often we're talking about what can we do, and you highlighted very well sort of this whole spectrum of, being cheated with recruiters and in some cases brokers, but actually in some cases you also have smugglers that have already cheated migrants. This role of the labor attachés that you had made as a recommendation, how do you really see it fitting into the spirit of return? How would having a labor attaché officer at an embassy really change the scope on return? And not that we are putting labor attachés only to deal with those migrants whom we are hoping to support economic development back home, but those who would be in a position that they would need to be returned. How would you see that different from the consular affair, for instance? So a bit of a practical question for you from a migrant's perspective, because usually we ask this question for sending countries to say, what would you see as the role? But actually from a migrant's perspective, maybe it's important for us to see what the distinction would be like. So we will come back to you in a moment. I will now introduce our next speaker as we go along, Mercedes Perez, who is going to actually, I think, share with us a short video about, I think the video will be self-explanatory, but before, I don't know, Mercedes, should I introduce you now or after you have done the video? Or maybe I go ahead with the introduction and then I will I will ask you to play the video that you wanted to share with us. Mercedes Perez is from Honduras, and she has a degree in management and social development. She currently works as the manager for the support program for returned migrants at Menonite Social Action Commission, which is in Honduras. She has over 20 years of experience in development work in the NGO sector in Honduras, and she participates regularly in national and international events as a panelist on migration issues. So we've asked Mercedes to share with us, what she thinks are some of the factors that motivate and cause the migratory movements from the North Triangle of Central America to the United States. So we wanted to understand return also from this perspective and from this continental perspective. So Mercedes, over to you. Dr. Sada, can we just make sure she's able to share screen, or is Rakesh sharing the video?
Yes, we can share now if needed.
Okay, go ahead.
1 minute, 1 minute.
Hola, muy buenos días. Muchas gracias por invitarnos a este importante webinar. Saludos desde Honduras. Soy Mercedes Pérez de la Comisión de Acción Social Menonita, como ya lo explicaba Fadi. Pues hemos estado desarrollando todo un proceso de reintegración de la población migrante retornada, sobre todo de poblaciones que llegan desde Estados Unidos. Este es un video que nosotros hemos recogido durante la última caravana migratoria y voy a dejarles que lo puedan ver y escuchar.
I think Dr. Sada, you need to share sound. Dr. Sada, you need to share sound.
El 15 de enero del 2021, más de 6.000 hondureños salieron en caravana desde la terminal de buses de San Pedro Sula hacia Guatemala en dirección a Estados Unidos.
Sí, igual como le vuelvo a repetir, la pobreza que no tenemos de dónde poder trabajar, nada, los pedacitos de finca que habían se arruinaron, no hay nada, vivimos en una montaña donde no hay trabajo para nadie. Si salimos a buscar trabajo no nos ofrecen, dicen que no, que por la pandemia, que no hay qué, pero no hay trabajo. Entonces igual por eso mismo nos motivamos a salir.
Como le digo, ayer venimos deportados, hoy vamos de regreso. ¿Qué hacemos estar en la casa encerrados? Como le digo, no hay trabajo. Si hubiera fuentes de trabajo, como hay en México, pues en México estábamos observando que eso, como hay fuentes de trabajo de fábricas, a cuáles mejores. La gente no busca ni para allá, es raro el que busca para allá y el que busca para acá. ¿Por qué? Porque tiene dónde sostenerse, eso es lo que duele. Ir, si sabe, voltear a ver para atrás, ver que usted deja a sus hijos, deja a su esposa, todo, ¿me entiende? Entonces eso le duele y pero como le digo, la necesidad lo obliga.
Luego de recorrer más de 147 kilómetros caminando o subidos en vehículos de carga pesada, exponiéndose a grandes peligros, lograron cruzar el punto fronterizo de El Florido en Copán.
El país está jodido y estamos pobres, pues no hay alimentos, no hay nada, no hay ni protección. Si Diosito los permite llegar, pues ya saben que sí. es la bendición que buscamos.
La caravana migrante continuó su ruta. No obstante, en Vado Hondo, Chiquimula, Guatemala, fueron frenados a golpes de palos y con gas lacrimógeno por efectivos del ejército de este país. Las razones por las que se van de Honduras son conocidas a nivel internacional: la violencia, la pobreza exacerbada por 2 huracanes, ETA e Iota, que devastaron el país a finales del 2020.
Todo perdido, todo. Nosotros hemos perdido todo del sector donde venimos. Venimos de Santa Bárbara, de San Marcos, Santa Bárbara.
La corrupción ingente en el gobierno y el caos en el manejo de la pandemia de coronavirus en el país.
Se han robado mucho dinero en el país y no es justo que nosotros abandonemos el país por cosas que hace el presidente del gobierno, pues, y no es justo, pues a nosotros nos duele abandonar nuestro país.
La Comisión de Acción Social Menonita, a través del programa Apoyo al Migrante, realizó el monitoreo de la caravana hasta la frontera del Florido. En San Pedro Sula brindó asistencia a 1.056 personas retornados en la terminal de buses de San Pedro Sula con alimentación, transporte, kit de higiene personal y hospedaje.
Bueno, muchas gracias por darnos este espacio de compartir este video que muestra la realidad de nuestros compatriotas que buscan constantemente la ruta migratoria hacia Estados Unidos, porque su meta es llegar a Estados Unidos. Son testimonios que a diario nosotros podemos ver. Ahí ustedes vieron en una de las personas que dijo: ayer vine deportado, pero hoy quiero irme nuevamente. Y parten en caravana cantidades de familias, unidades familiares completas, ante la falta de respuesta del Estado hondureño. Hemos visto cómo Centroamérica y la migración actual es más compleja que la de antaño. Hemos visto un aumento en el número de migrantes en tránsito, retornados, menores no acompañados y solicitantes de refugio, así como la cantidad de familias completas y de caravanas con alta visibilidad que transitan por México y por los países del norte de Centroamérica. Por tanto, la migración es hoy un asunto de alta prioridad en la agenda política y de desarrollo. En tanto, pues, mientras tenemos el Pacto Mundial sobre las Migraciones y qué respuestas se buscan de manera conjunta, la situación en los países centroamericanos sigue siendo igual. No vemos muchos cambios, no vemos muchas respuestas de los países firmantes ante este Pacto Mundial, que si bien es cierto, no es vinculante, pero los países firmantes deben cumplir este pacto porque nuestras poblaciones están día a día expuestas a constantes peligros. Honduras en los últimos días ha sido noticia internacional por las constantes caravanas migratorias y hemos visto cómo cada caravana, que pese a que se dice que estas caravanas son convocadas por ciertos grupos que tienen intereses políticos, intereses económicos y que atrás están estas personas, nosotros hemos visto que atrás de estas caravanas lo que hay es pobreza, miseria, desesperación, los altos niveles de violencia que vive el país obligan a la gente a huir. Entonces, el término caravana realmente se convierte en un término de éxodo migratorio. Estos éxodos que día a día se conforman ahora ya no solo por hombres, sino por mujeres y familias completas que han decidido salir del país o porque un grupo de maras y pandillas le dieron 24 horas para dejar su vivienda y tener que salir dejándolo todo atrás. Entonces, ¿qué tenemos? Estas personas también necesitan protección. Y aquí es donde hacemos el llamado a los organismos internacionales para que se les dé una protección real. Porque en nuestra intervención como Comisión de Acción Social Menonita hemos atendido personas que nos dicen, tengo miedo de regresar a mi casa porque estoy en este momento amenazado de muerte y no puedo regresar. Pero hemos visto la ausencia de esos sistemas de protección para que esta persona pueda ser trasladada a un sitio seguro, o que si es un solicitante de asilo pueda llevar toda la documentación y sea aceptable. Y eso no es posible. No lo hemos visto ahora en todas las atenciones que nosotros hemos dado, y es lamentable. Quiero comentarles que nosotros hemos atendido personas que después de 2 o 3 días han sido asesinadas en el país porque no se dio la respuesta. Y nuestra atención llega hasta la identificación, dar una atención psicológica en el momento, remitirlo a las instancias de protección, pero lamentablemente estas acciones se quedan a medias. Y ahí tenemos pues muertes de jóvenes menores de edad, hombres que quisieron retornar a su vivienda y fueron asesinados frente a su familia. Creo que nunca antes el tema migratorio había adquirido la relevancia y trascendencia que asume hoy, especialmente frente a las nuevas condiciones de salida de los países de origen. La violencia, como lo mencioné en un inicio, la inestabilidad política, las acciones del narcotráfico, los altos niveles de corrupción en países como los nuestros, tienen a un pueblo ahora en una total miseria. Y aparte, también tenemos las sequías, los desastres naturales que han provocado más pobreza y desigualdad. En el mes de noviembre fuimos fuertemente afectados por las tormentas ETA e IOTA, sin olvidar que el COVID-19 también vino a hundir más el país. Entonces, las tormentas ETA e IOTA desnudaron el débil sistema de respuesta del gobierno, al igual que la pandemia COVID-19 desnudó el débil sistema en salud. Y hemos visto cómo personas en plena pandemia abandonaron el país sin importarles que podían contagiarse en las fronteras. Y nos dicen, bueno, igual si yo me voy a exponer a morir en mi país, no me importa cruzar la frontera hacia Guatemala, pasar por México. Mi sueño es llegar a Estados Unidos porque yo necesito sostener a mi familia, yo necesito tener ingresos para darle educación a mis hijos. Mi sueño es hacerle la casa a mi madre. Hemos visto jóvenes, niños de 13 años que se arriesgan a irse en esa ruta migratoria porque sueñan en darle esa casa a su mamá, que no la tienen. Entonces aquí vemos una ausencia de políticas reales que permitan la integración de toda esta población en procesos, en acceso a vivienda digna, acceso a educación. Hay jóvenes, la mayoría que vienen deportados de nuestros registros, han cursado hasta el 4º grado de educación primaria. Hay quienes no saben leer y escribir. Y cuando les decimos que tienen que firmar un documento, porque por supuesto cuando nosotros damos ayuda humanitaria, algún tipo de apoyo, por cuestiones de transparencia y rendición de cuentas, se nos debe firmar nuestra documentación. Y muchos jóvenes pasan la pena y se esconden y nos dicen, fíjese que yo no puedo firmar, tengo que poner mi huella digital. Y son jóvenes que en pleno siglo XXI no deberían estar en este país, no deberían ser analfabetas, pero esa es la realidad que tenemos. ¿Cómo ha cambiado también la migración? En los últimos días estamos viendo, o en los últimos años, para ser exacta, hemos estado viendo muchas mujeres migrando, muchas mujeres abandonando el país para buscar alternativas fuera de las fronteras y verse como un actor de desarrollo importante a través del envío de remesas. Honduras vive de las remesas, Guatemala vive de las remesas, El Salvador y muchos países en el mundo. Si no fueran estas remesas, definitivamente estos países estaríamos hundidos en una mayor miseria. Lamentablemente, no estamos viendo tampoco que estos países respondan con un sistema de protección a estas personas que han contribuido con la economía, que han dejado su fuerza laboral en Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, o en España, porque ahora tenemos muchas personas buscando o yéndose a España porque hay oportunidades también laborales en esos países. Pero ¿qué está pasando? En este momento que pasó la tormenta ETA, una persona de 60 años perdió su casa. Ella dice que estuvo en Estados Unidos 20 años, trabajó por 20 años, mandó dinero, hizo su casa, regresó a Honduras porque quería vivir su vejez en este país. ¿Y qué pasó? Cuando las inundaciones, ella perdió su vivienda y dijo algo importante, me llamó la atención. ¿Quién me protege a mí? Yo envié remesas a Honduras, el gobierno, los bancos se lucraron de lo que yo mandé, pero no hay un sistema de protección para mí. Ahora, yo perdí mi casa, ya no tengo fuerza laboral, no tengo casa donde vivir y estoy a la deriva, porque no hay un sistema que la proteja. Entonces, creo que en este momento que estamos reunidos y que hay la voluntad de buscar mayor participación y protección para la población, se debería de pensar también en un sistema de pensión, de protección, qué sé yo, de jubilación para estas personas que están dejando su fuerza de trabajo en otros países, pero que sueñan en regresar. Porque creo que todos los que se van de nuestros países no se van porque les gusta Estados Unidos. No se van porque les apasiona España. Se van porque tienen la necesidad y porque se ven obligados a estar en ese país mientras tengan un ingreso, pero algún día van a regresar. Pero ¿qué va a pasar cuando vengan a este país y no se encuentren con un sistema que los proteja? Igual estamos viendo en este momento cómo los países de tránsito, como Guatemala y México, nuestras poblaciones se enfrentan a fuertes y a una constante violación de sus derechos humanos. En los países de destino, también como Estados Unidos, nos encontramos con políticas de deportación masivas, la criminalización de la migración para los indocumentados, racismo y xenofobia y otros aspectos que hacen que nuestras poblaciones cada vez se sientan mayormente marginadas. De acuerdo a los datos de la ONU, aproximadamente 1 millón de compatriotas han emigrado de Honduras. De esa total, un 58.94% son mujeres. Ojo con eso. Imagínense que la mayoría de personas, mujeres, están emigrando y el 41.5% son hombres que están históricamente son los que han abandonado el país. De esa población, de ese millón de hondureños, el 81.93% van hacia Estados Unidos, un 7.21% van hacia España y un 1.91% se queda en México. Bueno, y quiero decirles que ese 1.91%, ese pequeño porcentaje, se queda en México no porque quiere quedarse en México, sino porque encontraron una oportunidad ahí momentáneamente y en algún momento van a cruzar la frontera hacia Estados Unidos. Esa pequeña porción de población adquiere algún ingreso y pagan un coyote. Un coyote es la persona que los traslada hacia Estados Unidos y que estas personas tienen que pagar por lo menos $7,000 o $10,000 para cruzar la frontera hacia Estados Unidos. Eso explica el por qué la gente decide mejor irse en caravanas. Esa es la nueva modalidad. Nos vamos en caravanas porque no tenemos dinero para pagar un coyote. Nos vamos en caravana porque vamos más seguros. En su mente existe esa idea de que van más seguros porque van en
Mercedes,
grupo.
if I can just come in, and you know, just as I think you can come in and give us as a follow-up question as you are sharing. I think it's very important for us to sort of see the vulnerabilities, and I think there you're really disaggregating also the composition of this migrant population that's making these journeys in seeking improved livelihoods out of Honduras, the role of transit countries and work in transit countries, what that means. I think you've also very well, you know, brought out for us to understand vulnerabilities that are going to be associated with young women, and also understanding what it is for families that are left behind. And I think in the next, you know, when you come back, if you could just speak to us sort of how you see, you know, if the biggest composition of this migrant group is women, you know, how ready is the Honduras government or social protection systems? How ready are they? And I would guess it's also women who have also traveled with children, or those who would be coming back with children. How ready are they to receive returnees in this aspect as we talk about sustainable reintegration? I mean, I think what you've poured out for me is sort of a situation where you look like and you say, how can first of all, how can return even happen? How can return happen in this difficult place where there's a constant outflow, a constant push for people to want to go and seek a livelihood because the political situation doesn't allow it and the economic situation would not be able to sustain it. So in thinking about, you know, what you envision, you know, what you sort of see as the preparedness, if at all you see it, in terms of the gender aspect of women coming back, what kind of spaces are there? What kind of work can they find back in Honduras? How would they be reintegrated back into society? How are they also looked at when they return back? From this very traumatic, what I would say is a traumatic experience, from how you transit going, living in the caravans, as opposed to having to live in much more freer spaces. So I think, you know, that would be great for you to walk us through in, and then maybe also touch a bit on how are civil society organizations supported, such as the organization that you are working for. I see this is a question that is actually being discussed in the chat group on how, as you know, how do you get support that you need to run the different activities? Because it seems as though a lot of the work is being done by civil society organizations. How are they then supported to support whether it's the return process, or it's the reintegration part of it, or it's encouraging safe and dignified returns? So maybe when you come back, you can walk us through that. Maybe I just get our last speaker in, as we are seeing we're almost 1.5 hours into our chat, and we would like to open the floor in a bit before I will ask the panelists to come back with their second questions for a minute or two. Can I ask Jeremiah, you're here with us, and Jeremiah Opiniano is an assistant professor in journalism at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, and he's been involved in international migration as a journalist and an academician, as well as a researcher, and writing about migration thematic areas for over 15 years. And Jeremiah, if you could just come and, you know, speak to us about what you see are the feasible deliverables. You know, so we've come from this country of origin, and I think Mercedes' presentation was really brought us back into the country of origin and understanding the problems that are there. How would you see would be the, you know, the feasible deliverables that these countries of origin and also of destination, if you can employ to ensure that you have a safe and dignified return, as well as looking at aspects of reintegration? And when you speak into that, could you just nose in a little bit on migration health and psychosocial support, which of course is an important element, not just for the return process, but really throughout the migration journey. So Jeremiah, if you could speak to us about that. Thank you.
So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm from the Philippines. I'm here on my final night in a quarantine hotel, so it's like returning home as well. I think my insights here will be at least from the standpoint of looking from afar about what the different experiences of the countries covered here have experienced surrounding return migration and reintegration. So for this insight, I wish to pose a gut question, in which is, I think, mentioned by Ms. Paddy here, which is, what are the feasible deliverables that both countries of origin and destination can employ to assure safe, dignified, and I think healthy return, readmission, and reintegration? I think this gut question is, for me, premised under the generally non-binding nature of the Global Compact on Migration. Migration agreements such as this have been there for quite some time. It has been a decades-long battle since the global forums on migration and development have been happening until now, recently also. Another context here is balancing the delicate diplomatic nature of handling return migrations by legal and irregular migrants and refugees, which is related to a third context, which is respecting the human rights of returnees. We also have to account to have a sense of balance the views of citizens from the destination country of how do they think of migrants in general and later on refugees, because these contexts are relevant to a current twist, which is the pandemic. So I think many of the panelists have given good insights and recommendations. So I'll just either reiterate some of them or hopefully give some new ones. And this is governed by a main thesis statement, which is this: as return migrations by migrants and refugees continue, including those induced by the policies of host countries, countries' approaches to facilitate safe, healthy, dignified return warrant another look. I think some things may work out before, but persistent approaches may not. Meanwhile, socioeconomic reintegration, or what is called in this webinar sustainable reintegration, rests on how origin countries' economic conditions or even political situations provide people's needs, and how government mechanisms, if there are any in the origin countries especially, ease reintegration efforts by individual returnees. So we kind of recognize the destination countries for handling migrants while they are abroad, who are earning a living and contributing to development in the host country. Also recognize their efforts, some of these or many host countries, to facilitate safe and orderly return migrations, because some of them, they collaborate with different offices coming from the host country and even from representatives from origin countries. And if migrants were trafficked and host country governments assisted them, their efforts may have to be appreciated. Although, of course, the pandemic saw different host countries handling these return migrations differently. And just some numbers, if I may share, I think in Sri Lanka, the estimate is 60,000 migrant workers repatriated from various countries. Here in the Philippines, which has an organized migration bureaucracy and perhaps an organized return migration system that is so much burdened by this pandemic, officially, there were 327,511 land-based and sea-based migrants repatriated. In the context of Afghanistan, which is largely displacement and refugee movements, I was shocked to find that last year, coming from Iran alone, an estimated 860,000 returned to Afghanistan. And then if we include Pakistan, of which the returnees from there are around 7,900, so two countries alone, that's 868,000. So at least the pandemic gave us some faces into this phenomenon called return migration that we have to be concerned about, I guess. Migrants, when given the chance, and if host country laws allow them, to the extent these laws accommodate, I think they will naturally think of staying in the host country. During crisis situations like this pandemic and the 2008-2009 global economic crisis, don't be surprised that majority of migrants may have decided to stay put. And in situations like in Venezuela or in Syria or Afghanistan, of which the situations are unsafe, I think staying put overseas becomes a no-brainer. To be fair, host countries suddenly became conscious, and this is a surprising observation, of the welfare of migrants and refugees because of the pandemic. I think because travel is one major mode of pathogen transmission that affects both origin and host countries, and host countries confront prevailing individual and community transmissions, migrants had to be given health and social services. But the repatriation, reintegration, return migration approaches have been there for the longest time. And the IOM representative here had given an example in the case of Portugal. So some countries have repatriation programs like Russia. In some European countries, they enacted laws to cover migrant repatriation and to encourage their migrants to return home. During this pandemic, for example, Maldives and its immigration office, its Ministry of Economic Development, and its police services coordinated the repatriation of some 13,000 plus migrants from 7 origin countries as of July last year. Korea and its employment permit system, for example, started in 2015 services for returnees, for workers returning from their APS work sorties. And this is an example, I guess, of what is called circular migration, because some host countries would like the workers to come, but eventually they may have to go home. So the question begs, how many host countries have facilitative return migration programs, and how many origin countries operate reintegration programs and services for returnees? Because I think answering how many of these countries do so leads us to knowing what are these programs and services by the 2 countries concerned. And these can provide indications of how countries fulfill Objective 21 of the Global Compact on Migration and Refugees. There is also a related question. How have bilateral and multilateral organizations pitched in to address return migrations? I think past and present, as given earlier as an example, there are assisted voluntary return and reintegration programs, or AVRR programs. Some of these may have availed of support from multilateral organizations to invite migrants to return home and avail of what they call cash incentives. We could only hope that some migrants, or many migrants, thought this as an incentive to go home, especially if they are voluntarily and willing, if they are willing to return home for one reason or another. These measures seem to be ongoing, even pushed by bilateral and multilateral organizations, and assessing similar initiatives, if they worked in the past or not, deserves a revisit. Interestingly, the German government supported origin countries in forming advice centers for jobs by migrants and returnees. One of the countries that Germany supported is Kosovo, that created such centers that gives advice for employment training, refers clients to relevant stakeholders like firms, provide psychosocial support for returnees, like those Kosovars coming from Germany, to return to the labor market in the home country, and even offering targeted services for women and returnees with mental health challenges. I think the same approach in Kosovo was done in Tunisia and Senegal. The ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is also another example, and this is largely influenced by the Philippines, whose decades-old migration management bureaucracy includes offices, programs and services for return migrants and reintegration, and even a welfare fund for migrant workers. And for the longest time, I think since the Iraq War in the early 90s, repatriation assistance. And as I had said earlier, I think the Philippines had the most challenging time to handle repatriations and return migrations last year. So with the Philippine model as guide, the ASEAN issued last November only an official set of guidelines for countries in the region to facilitate effective return and reintegration. And the countries in the region have to abide. It is interesting also to see if more origin countries will have mechanisms, programs, or perhaps incentives, or even offices handling reintegration. Because I noticed that during the early months of the pandemic, when some Middle East host countries encourage migrants, their origin countries, the migrants' origin countries to repatriate their citizens, I think some of those origin countries kind of hesitated, and they were telling the host countries to please consider moving the scheduled repatriations back so that we could prepare. But other origin countries with systems in place had to primarily address the welfare of compatriots and repatriate them. Upon their return migrant workers were even tested and quarantined, the latter of no cost to migrant workers in the case of the Philippines, and escorted even to their origin communities. So for origin countries, I think they may have to review their return migration and reintegration policies, programs, or even program mechanics, interagency coordination, and financial resources. Perhaps return migration interventions consist of mostly one-off services like financial grants or loans, labor counseling, psychosocial services, to name a few. But if returnees bring with them welfare and health issues, I think interventions for these types of returnees may have to be sustained. But I wish to remind the room that migration and development in general demands a whole of society approach. Specifically, reintegration experiences, particularly economic reintegration, will be gainful and sustainable for returnees depending on I think it has been said in the chat room, on the economic conditions of origin countries and communities. The same with their political situations. Economically, also reintegration becomes gainful given the financial knowledge and capabilities of returnees and their families. Because I think there have been some studies about some migrant workers having low levels of financial education. So when they return, the way that they may handle their surplus earnings coming from migrant work may be in question. Returnees will still carry hang-ups of earning more overseas unless they accept personally that coming home has economic, social welfare, and family benefits. I think even origin countries where migrants return to are, even if they are prosperous, migrants may even try to utilize from migration and remittances to diversify the risk of not only earning from return migration, but even having some family members go overseas and doing other livelihood activities. And finally, and at the same time, return migration and reintegration interventions, I believe, may need to incorporate newer approaches to these initiatives through a new twist. And I'm talking about what was mentioned by Ms. Paddy earlier, which is mental health and psychosocial support services for returnees, especially given this pandemic, of which, as the video earlier showed in the case of Honduras, I think MHPSS interventions are relevant, because pandemics will happen again and we will be better prepared, hopefully, with such initiatives than never at all. Thank you.
Wow, I think you have managed to summarize for us, and actually this was an important role that we are very happy that you took on to really run through, just giving us also a global perspective, because we've really touched on different continents that looks at the subject on returns, readmission, and reintegration. So thank you very much, Jeremiah, for that. I think you will, in your comeback question, in your last feedback, if you could just speak maybe very shortly on looking at, the concept of, you came in talking about sending countries and receiving countries in terms of facilitating assistance and voluntary returns. And we're seeing that sometimes that assistance is looked more in a financial perspective, but sometimes that assistance actually should be coming from a more procedural way. We do know that there are countries, for instance, that will charge migrants that have overstayed on their territories by charging them some kind of penalty, which increases over the years. So let's say I've overstayed for a year, I have to pay $100, and that continues to increase for so many number of years. And it becomes sort of a deterrent for migrants to want to return home, because they know that they have these penalties and charges that have to be paid. So in that way, maybe you can talk to us a bit about what you've seen as a trend around immigration policies that have deterred, and how that changed a bit with COVID. We have some examples, and I think it would be good to hear from you, some of the examples we've heard where, undocumented have been made documented, taking out of people from detention centers and reducing the amount of detention that will go because people are undocumented. So speaking to us a bit about moving away from money, because sometimes I think host countries are saying, no, we won't allow these returns because there are these administrative issues. So the disconnect between what migration authorities want to see and what the border says is the rule and the law in terms of following up. So that would be interesting to hear. I think you brought out some very interesting aspects there of the financing and sort of this framework. So we have these frameworks. We know IOM is really sitting with this reintegration framework. We know that also initiatives have been taken at the level of the European Union, working together with the IOM in what is known from the African continent perspective is the European Union Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, which particularly, as part of that, which looks at this joint initiative for migrant protection and reintegration, particularly looking at migrant protection and reintegration. And there it's talking about, the safe return. So this aspect of transit countries, and here it's a lot of migrants that are stuck in Niger, who would be stuck in Libya or in other places. But of course, this program particularly focuses on the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, in that region, and how migrants are being facilitated to return home. And you made an interesting point where during COVID, some countries had even come up to say, no, we're not ready to take our people back, because we cannot manage the health situation here. We don't have open borders, and people are voluntarily wanting to go home. So, it's this whole concept of what is the right thing to do. The right thing to do should be to focus on the migrant who is saying, I would like to go home, and not shut the borders so they're neither there or there. Some remained stranded in airports because they had nowhere to go as such. And even though they were not irregular at some point, they were just, stranded because their countries were not opening up borders for them. So it would be interesting also to hear in sort of these administrative tweaks that have happened, and looking at COVID as an example. And thank you again for sharing, all those numbers and reflection, and I, like you said, COVID really had a way of showing us this. There's some questions which we have in our chat box. And before I get to that, I would just ask our panelists now to have a look in the chat box. Maybe you can pick 1 or 2 questions together with the questions that I asked you. We will come back in a little bit to you to give me just 2 minutes of your reflection, because we'll be closing down soon as I go through the question. There is a question, I think, that has talked about sort of this global approach, but maybe if somebody can also speak to how the global speaks to the local, because we know that there are global approaches for returns, there are global approaches, there are even agreements that have been made in some particular countries at a bilateral level, or even at a continental level. For instance, for the European Commission, or for the European Union rather, they have gone ahead and signed readmission agreements with a number of countries in terms of that facilitates the return process and the reintegration of migrants. So in speaking about that, how do different countries localize this? So I don't know if any of the panelists is feeling comfortable in talking about returns in that perspective. It may not be in an EU example, it could be another example, but of talking about an overarching global approach that has been stipulated. Many people have signed up to it and say, yes, it's a good idea, but how is it really implemented at the home level? Before I just encourage our panelists. I know Luis has to rush off. Luis, do you just want to come in and give us your 1 minute response to that and your 1 minute takeaway?
Okay, yeah, indeed, I need to rush in 2 minutes, so I will try to do my best to accommodate the questions. Super. And as best as I can. So about your 2 questions, I would like to highlight 2 points with 2 publications associated that I think that can bring further information to this discussion. So in what relates to reintegration, indeed, there is a reintegration framework, and this is the base for IOM work. This reintegration, this integrated approach to reintegration is based on monitoring, evaluation, and learning about 3 dimensions of reintegration: economic dimension, social dimension, and psychological dimension, at 3 levels: individual, community, and structural. I'm pretty sure that some of us, that some of you listening to this information are familiar with this approach. But for those that are not, I invite you to check on the IOM publication store. It is a free publication on the reintegration handbook, which is the base for reintegration assistance, and how we work reintegration, and what tools we are using, and how this is perceived. On a practical notice, and for the experience that we have, it is important to notice the specificity of Brazil, and most of the reintegration implementation projects or plans that we are assisting are related to create some micro business, and the ones that are not related to that are related to do some training or specific training or recycling knowledge or so on. So now there is an impact with the pandemic and all of this, and linking with the second point that you raised, which is how this impacts. This has a huge impact, because when just to give you an example, a migrant returns, there's reintegration support, and it will arrive exactly in the same situation, meaning the scenario that he is in Portugal, which is partial or full lockdown, a lot of impact on mobility, obligation to stay at home. So if you have a plan, you go you return to your country of origin, you have a plan to implement some reintegration assistance, and you arrive there, and how will you do? Because together with the impact that return as with reintegration and put forward your plan, you need to consider as well COVID-19 impact and how this impacts. If you, for instance, you want to buy some goods to sell or some products to foster your business plan, this has an impact, and this is important to consider. So there are significant challenges associated to COVID-19. This includes not only the lockdown, mobility restrictions, but also access to migrants, including those that are in vulnerable situations. Moving from face-to-face to virtual has an impact, and it is important to stress this. It's not the same thing. It is what it is. It is what we have to continue to assist migrants, but it is not the same thing. And it has some challenges. But in general, IOM continued to provide assistance during COVID-19 outbreak, adjusting their programs and including some challenges. I will invite all of you to check migrant and protection assistance during COVID-19, promising practices. This is a publication that is available on Return and Reintegration platform, which is available to everyone as well, and that I will use to close my second intervention. I will need to leave now. Unfortunately, I cannot stay much longer, but I will be available to address any other question that might come up. Just might write me an email message. I will be glad to further discuss any questions related to this. And once again, thank you very much for inviting us and for giving us the floor to explain how we do and how we work on return and reintegration. Thank you very much.
Luis, it was a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for sharing all the insights. We will gather, if we see any other questions, we will gather them and revert back to you. And I think it's not the last time we see you on this platform. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I would just, looking in the room, I know we do have, I know Joe Saite, you had your hand up. If I would like, if I call upon some of the speakers in the room, we do have what we call sometimes a side panel, which would be people who are sitting here with us that join us often, or experts on this particular topic. And we just invite you. I would really ask that you share only for a minute, because we would like our panelists to just get back to us with the wealth of questions that is in the Q&A. So starting with Joe. Kindly unmute Joe, and Dr. Sada, if Eva Richer is here with us. I'm not sure if William is here with us as well. I'm just looking through to see. William, are you here with us? Or if anyone would like to say something, and you can do it in 1 minute, I'm giving the floor for about 3 minutes. Okay, so 2 participants have raised their hand. If Karim Radhi, if
yes,
we could unmute him.
Am I clear? Can you hear
yes,
me?
Karim, go ahead.
Okay, there is one point I didn't know. It doesn't come, unfortunately, under any objective. It is with regard to if one of family member of the worker is studying in university or in a private school, and he has already paid the fees, and because of coronavirus or because of any other reason, the family breadwinner is dismissed or resigned, then when the labor visa is abolished, there is no independent visa for the family. Then the family member should have to leave the university or have to leave his school. So I searched all the objectives of the GCM, but unfortunately I didn't find that point under any one of them. So this is very important, because here in Bahrain I received some complaints with this regard. In fact, we couldn't do anything for them, because according to rules and regulations, the family visa is bind with the family of their breadwinner. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karim, for that. I will ask maybe one of the panelists to have to respond to that. You could add it as part of the response, or is there someone else in the room who would like to?
Hola, buenos días.
Yes.
Padi, hola.
Yes, Mercedes, go ahead.
Hola, Padi. ¿Puedo? Sí, bueno, esta pregunta interesante sobre el acceso a la educación de la población, quiero comentarles que nosotros en nuestro programa de respuesta de reinserción estamos dando justamente becas a jóvenes universitarios que abandonaron el país, por ejemplo, los deportaron y tuvieron que reinsertarse al sistema educativo. Entonces tenemos varias experiencias de jóvenes que están cursando la universidad. Justamente el sábado también se nos graduó una joven en enfermería, una área con un costo realmente elevado en el país, y nosotros aportamos en ese sentido, gracias al apoyo de la Iglesia Evangélica Luterana en Estados Unidos, la ELCA, el CCM, que nos aporta para reinsertar a estos jóvenes. Y tengo que aprovechar también para decirles que muchos jóvenes van a cursos técnicos vocacionales y hacemos todo un proceso de abordaje psicológico con profesionales en el área que les permite superar esa situación que vivieron durante la ruta. Así que creo que el sector educación, el tema educación es clave en un país como los nuestros, donde los jóvenes no tienen oportunidad, y creo que vale la pena invertir en esa área.
Thank you, Mercedes. Thank you for that reaction. I think I will ask if we also had, because I also see that this particular question is in terms of loss of education allowances that have been paid, or fees, you know, so somebody has paid fees in that particular country. And I think that we can also sort of envelope this as the total loss that the breadwinner has had to lose, not in terms of just of their earnings, but and future earnings. And in some cases you have, you know, school fees that have not been paid for. I don't know if maybe Aniwar, you've come through a situation like this on how it has gone about, but if not, I think we could try and address this issue and pass it on to our friends at the Migrant Forum in Asia, who may have gone through really looking at provisions of how migrants who have lost earnings or lost any kind of fees could take it up, could take up in terms of what a way forward is in this context. Joe, are you ready? And Bilal after, a minute, please. Joe, if you can unmute yourself, or Bilal. Okay. So maybe we go to our panelists, maybe starting with Mercedes, because I have you on the screen already. Mercedes, do you just want to come back to us and, you know, respond to the question and give your 1 minute feedback? So altogether, just a minute to wrap up what you would say have been your, you know, your key reflections in sharing in this session.
Bueno, gracias, Paddy. En nuestro caso, pues la mayoría de jóvenes no tienen acceso a una educación privada. Tienen acceso a educación pública porque sus condiciones no lo permiten. Y cuando retornan bajo un sistema prácticamente obligado, donde el maestro tiene que aceptarlo. Nosotros aportamos a ciertos estudiantes que de educación pública, por ejemplo, para que puedan pagarse su transporte, alimentación, y raros casos tenemos de jóvenes de educación privada que cuando retornan, si se les perdona la deuda, entonces pueden continuar sus estudios. No tenemos casos así como que lo han perdido todo. Interesante. Con respecto a las reflexiones, pues yo que quisiera concluir también diciéndoles que nosotros tenemos sí familias que han hipotecado su casa, o sea, sacar un préstamo para poder pagar el coyote. Y resulta que cuando vienen al país ya tienen una deuda, el coyote los obliga a pagar, los amenazan y tienen que tomar la ruta nuevamente. Entonces, esas son experiencias fuertes, duras. Pero, ¿qué nos traen esta reflexión? Y qué interesante estos espacios donde compartimos problemas similares todas las regiones. Creo que el hacer estas reflexiones de manera conjunta nos va a permitir incidir ante estos foros mundiales, ante los países, y pedir que se respeten los derechos de las personas. Y como tú lo decías, Paddy, no solo se trata de la parte económica, sino el recuperar ese estado emocional de la persona y que se sienta que son sujetos de derechos, sujetos políticos y que también pueden generar cambios, ya sea en nuestros países o fuera de estos países. Muchas gracias.
Mercedes, thank you very much for that. Jeremiah?
Thank you, Ms. Padu, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I think the theme today had brought along a lot of wide-ranging global experiences, even multilateral or bilateral experiences that we can learn from, just reflecting the different types of return and the different types of return migrants, and then the recent issue that was brought up with student migration. I think, well, as a takeaway, I think the pandemic, and I would like to go back to the pandemic because it unmasked everything about human living, and specifically migration, and more specifically reintegration, return migration. I think the pandemic provided many precedents and first-time approaches, and it even revisited things that in the normal times we didn't think that it will be reversed, but surprisingly it happened. Like, for example, what Portugal did in the early days of the pandemic, that they, I think, gave health services to irregular migrants, and other countries, I think, followed suit. So that's kind of a first. And I think it's I don't want to say that the pandemic is good, but I'm just saying that the pandemic unmasked many things that for the first time, I think the world became more human to migrants after a long while. I think I may be wrong, but I think 2020 marked an opportunity for us to, I think, in the context of return migration, reintegration, readmission, which I agree with the first speaker, it's a no-brainer. Migrants should be allowed to go back home. I think the pandemic provided opportunities to revisit approaches to return migration and see how Objective 21 can be a guide for us to see if these approaches worked or not. And then it also allows us to learn from more experiences from other countries, different types of return migrants who were involved in the process, including what was mentioned by the moderator about trans-migration. I think it's also important in the return journey. So I hope that participants here were able to learn about these different aspects of this whole ranging issue of return migration. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Anisur?
Yeah, thank you. Give me that. Do you hear me? Yeah, okay. First time I mentioned some gaps and some recommendation. And my second part, due to time is very short, I will just go very quick with some bullet points. Before that, I just saw one comments in chat box. Our government has some program for the student stipend, especially the migrants workers kids have some good stipend. So if any migrant workers lose their job, but their children will not be disconnected from school, our government has some good stipend program. And another thing, due to for returning migrants, our government has a lot of program like the integration program. Our government has some medical support program, reintegration program, especially the COVID-19 period. Government has allowed 500,000 taka with a very soft condition. So our government has some nice program for the returnees, and we civil society have some program also like that. Initially, Paddy asked me about some from our country. Lot of people are trafficked in the name of labor migration. So our organization support those victims, And we have some pre-decision and pre-departure program also, where we award those prospective migrants. Recently, we have rescue for human for Bangladeshi migrants in Togo. Those were trafficked and they were in human condition under the traffickers. 2 months before, our foundation with the others international organization and our government. Initially, I mentioned some gaps of our government, but in fact, our government also come forward to the civil society, and we have jointly rescue those trafficked person. And more than 2 months, they are now in Togo, but under a trade union shelter. But due to financial ground, we cannot repatriate them. And other things, in Jordan, there is a lot of garments factories. There is time to time unrest situation. We intervene there with our government and local local NGOs and others. So I will not go more. Thank you. Give me the chance.
Thank you, Arisu. Thank you.
And on behalf of all migrant workers, I thanks to all of our participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and a big thank you to you for your personal contribution into this and really bringing out for us what we consider as migrant voices as well into this discussion, which are very critical. Dr. Raj?
Thanks, Patty. My reflections, I think the issue of reintegration, if the IOM has a framework, I would like to have a look at it, because this is the whole of society approach. It's not just the NGOs or civil society organizations or governments. It's a collective approach. But listening to what is happening actually, how actually return is going to take place in the midst of situations, political, economic turmoil, safety issues, and so on, especially in the case of Central American countries, where there is the issue of criminality, safety, if not political turbulence, but definitely economic issue. So are we talking about reintegration that people will be willing to come back, or they're going to be forcibly removed? And that's the reintegration we are talking about. So there are two aspects. In other words, and that's important, because if people are being forced to leave because they cannot be accepted in a host country and the host country wants them to leave, where do they go? They leave the place because it is unsafe for them. No, and they are just moving from transit this place to that place, from Mexico, to see if they can cross over to the US. And now the new route that is happening, and I was surprised, is French Guyana. French Guyana is in it's in South America, and it's a French territory. So somehow Central American, including Venezuelans, people from Cuba, and some other countries are going to Brazil, because you can get a visa to Brazil. You can fly over to Brazil. You can get a tourist visa, tourist visa. And from there you take a boat and you go to French Guyana, which is a French territory. That means you're now in the EU, in an EU country. And from there, you languish for a while where your case is being discussed, you make some money, and if possible, you take a local flight or a domestic flight and you enter France. How many have succeeded? I don't know. But the experiences have been pretty bad, where some Cubans and Venezuelans were saying, we are stuck. We are stuck in a COVID situation. Our processes, things are not being processed because they don't have the capacity, because that island with 300,000 people is not meant to process the refugee cases. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the resources. Now they're in a very serious limbo. So in other words, people are desperate, just like joining a caravan, whatever it takes. You die at home, you die along the road. So this is a very serious situation. So I don't know what we're talking about. Reintegration, are we talking about integration? In other words, do we need to integrate our people? It's not so much reintegrating the returnees, but also those who leave. have to be given the opportunity. And as Paddy was saying, shall we use those who have the experience to migrate as messengers to share stories that migration journeys are not easy journeys. Migration journeys are painful and they are full of trials and tribulations. And before you take a step, you think twice and see how. So that means now the pressure needs to be put on home countries as well as support from bilateral organizations and agencies, how to create an environment where as much as possible, there is a bit of greater insight, information before people take a step out. So I think it's very, very painful listening to what is happening in Honduras and other Central American countries. It's just heartbreaking, What is the solution? I don't know what the solution is. But I am a bit puzzled. I mean, I am not very pleased with this thing, Objective 21, the reintegration. Are you talking about handful of people? You're talking about bunches and groups of people. What about farm workers now who are going to the US or Canada for 3 months as part of circular migration and they have to come back? But now they cannot go because of the borders are closed and because of the pandemic. And the same applies to people who work on ships. There are hundreds and thousands of people who are working in these cruise ships. Now, there are no cruise ships anymore for the time being. There might be an isolated one or two. So they are also, in a way, circular migrants. They spend 6 months, 9 months, they have to go home for 3 months. Then they have to reapply and go through all that process and so on. So I think the situation is, I think this is a moment for reflection as to what kind of development are we, what kind of development trajectory are we shaping for ourselves in our home countries. And then the rest becomes a talk show. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So
Thank you very much,
I hope,
Dr. Raj.
So I hope that answered your circular migration, the pandemic.
I think, yes, I think so. And I think other participants and panelists as well have managed to touch on it. As we wrap up, thank you to all our panelists who have been here with us. I think it's a very difficult way to even conclude in 1 or 2 sentences, except to say, I think we really need to understand what return is. We need to still understand for ourselves, because then when I say understand, it's really at the localized level. We know global approaches are there, frameworks are there that guide us on what a reintegration should look like. And as some of the colleagues who have been on the table, they've explained the economic, the social, the psychological, and also looking at the different levels from the individual, the structure, as well as the community. But there's still a lot of work that has to be done. COVID has come, and I think it's managed to unmask our eyes, but we haven't fully opened our eyes to some of the challenges that we still have. The interrelation between return, smuggling, trafficking, which still remains a part of you when you have been returned, knowing that you may have debts to pay where you're coming from. We heard this from our South American colleagues as well, from the North American perspective as well. And understanding how these linkages are. The linkages also with, what's happening around wage theft, what's happening around financial losses for your return. So, really giving this definition of return, not as light as just deciding I'm going to go home, but a lot of different consequences because of this decision to return home. And also the decision to return home, whose decision is it? I think these are things that have been unpacked and have been well explained here, but still there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We cannot ignore that. As we leave it. So maybe that is what we can take away. Can we take away the fact that we have political blindness as well to understanding legal pathways and increased incentives for circular migration? What would that mean? Does that reduce what we have? How about alternatives to return? I think some of the speakers have also spoken about this. The social safety net, what's really happening to migrants when they return? The communities at home, how are they receiving our returnees in the communities, in our government structures, in the local government structures? How are they welcomed back in? This whole would fit with this sustainable reintegration picture that we have that goes indeed, as Dr. Raj has said, beyond what we have written down as guidelines. And with that task at hand, I would like to thank our panelists who were here, thank all the participants. We had a full room at some point and now we still have 124, but I think we've taken a lot of time today in deliberating the Global Compact for Migration Objective Objective 21. And I thank you very much. Please look forward to our next webinar next week. We're here at the same time, and we're still running for a few more weeks before the end of this series. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to everyone, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Dr. Raj, thank you. Jeremiah, thank you.